The Cold War is really difficult to teach because you are either going through it chronologically by each administration, in which case you are bouncing over several topics: foreign policy, domestic politics, Red Scare, economics, race relations, and every administration you're kind of going through that list, or topically or thematically. And for this course, we are going over it topically. I realize history doesn't happen thematically and topically, but it's easier to get significance out of it, from my experience, if you do it thematically. So that is why we are going to be looking at this stuff thematically and going back to look at the politics of the Cold War. As a generalization, during the Cold War, the two parties were actually very, very similar, especially when you compare it to today. Or other certain periods, the parties differed wildly, but during the Cold War, the two parties were not that different, in that they both supported, or they both believed that socialism, communism, Soviet Union was dangerous and a threat to the United States. And they both believed in the basic idea of the welfare state and believed in using the federal government to advance society and make society better for a majority of the population. So the Republicans will consistently attack Democrats as being weak on communism. Partly because of that, ironically enough, Democrats end up taking a stronger stance against the Soviet Union quite often. And I don't mean that in a good way. Sometimes they do it in a way that's generally agreed to be good, and sometimes in ways that are overwhelmingly negative. And Republicans are actually the ones that will start a lot of the peace talks. So that is a consistent theme running through the politics of the Cold War. And we especially see that when we look at the administrations of Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Starting with Eisenhower. So if you remember, the Korean War started in 1950, and it had ground to a stalemate, and Truman was forced to fire Douglas MacArthur. Republicans accused him of being soft on communism for losing China and firing MacArthur. And so in the election of 1952, Republicans will run Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is the general that was responsible for overseeing the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, D-Day. Eisenhower really, really disliked Douglas MacArthur as well. A lot of people that met MacArthur disliked him. The only people that really, really loved him are people that knew him from afar and as an idea. Eisenhower was a hero of World War II, so he will run as a Republican in 1952. The Democrats will nominate a guy named Adlai Stevenson. And now, this is not a criticism of Democrats as a party or their policies or anything about today, but historically, they have a long track record of being bad at politics and electing people that are not popular, and also running bad campaigns, like not reading the mood of the country. 1952, Adlai Stevenson, look at what they're running on. Which will be safer for you? The party of Hoover, red lines, homelessness, bank closed, or the party of Roosevelt? Higher wages, better homes, Social Security. They're running on the Great Depression in the middle of the greatest economy the world has ever seen. Understandably, they will lose, and they lose overwhelmingly. Dwight D. Eisenhower will win handily, and he breaks the Solid South. Now, he is from Denison, Texas, so of course Texas will vote Republican for their favorite son. And when Dwight D. Eisenhower comes into office, he and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, say that they are going to get tough on communism. Truman had been weak, and so they will get tough on communism by using massive retaliation and liberation. What does massive retaliation mean? It implies, they very strongly implied, well, like China invaded or attacked during the Korean War, massive retaliation implies the atomic bomb. That is what massive retaliation would mean. And liberation, so liberating the people in Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe that were under the control of the Soviet Union. Now, these sound very good, and this is the kind of stuff Americans wanted to hear, but it became clear very quickly that while these sound good, they are just not realistic. And it became clear in Hungary. In the country of Hungary, there was a revolt, and the people there, in direct response to Dulles and Eisenhower saying they would liberate them, rose up in revolt. So their revolt was based on the fact that they heard what Dulles said, and they believed them. And so the Hungarians will revolt with the assumption that the United States is going to come in and provide assistance. The Hungarian revolt actually went fairly well for a little while. They were able to capture some of the major towns to the point that the Soviet Union actually said that they were willing to negotiate and pull Soviet forces out of Hungary. General rule of thumb, it's best not to believe the Soviet Union when they tell you something, because, of course, they went back on their word, especially when they realized the United States was not coming to help, and they will brutally suppress the Hungarian revolt. And it is brutal. To this day, people in Hungary, they still resent the United States for saying, we will help you. And then once they started the revolt, the United States did not come. And the United States didn't liberate them for a very good and obvious reason. Soviet Union has atomic weapons and mutually assured destruction. So while the get tough rhetoric played well with the American public, it was very difficult to actually enact. And during Eisenhower's administration, he will also start the first peace talks with the Soviet Union. The first summit talks are peace negotiations, begin under Eisenhower with the Soviet Union. First summit conference was held in Geneva, that's in Switzerland, between the big four, France, England, the United States, the Soviet Union. And they will agree to, they get into talks about limiting nuclear weapons. And while the talks will not exactly produce very much, it is important that the United States was starting to engage in peace talks. But again, Eisenhower, his Vice President Nixon, they were constantly hammering Democrats about being weak on communism, and yet they will hold the first peace talks. So if Truman had done this, he would have just been eaten alive by the Republicans and by the majority of Americans. But when Eisenhower did it, because he is so associated with war and the military, people cheered him on. So the Geneva talks won't go incredibly far, but it is an important step to begin peaceful talks and discussions of not aiming so many nuclear weapons at each other. Shortly after this, the United States will experience, to Americans, one of the most horrific things, the realization that the Soviets were actually outpacing the United States in outer space. Soviets launched the first Earth orbiting satellite called Sputnik. And when they do, the United States just freaks out. If they're able to do this, then they could put bombs on them, nukes on them. And so it will launch the space race. And when the United States decides it wants to really do something, it has the money and the resources that it goes all in. And that's why the United States is so good at dealing with emergencies, because this was considered an emergency. So in response to this, Congress will pass legislation that greatly enhances America's defense spending in terms of science and education and military research. Part of that was the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, that was located in Houston, Texas, and the passage of the National Defense Education Act. The National Defense Education Act is really important because it's the largest federal expenditures to higher education to that point. So this is something that is very consistent during the Cold War, is when America sees a threat, they will just pour a bunch of money into it, and being the richest country in the world, it's able to actually get a lot done in a very little time. For some reason, you'll hear people say a lot, especially in regards to paying teachers more, well, you can't just throw money at a problem and fix it. Turns out, yes, you can. We've done it so many times throughout U.S. history. And so we dump a ton of money, which, again, having a highly educated workforce is really, really important for a good economy. And this all happens during Eisenhower's administration. Again, Eisenhower will support putting a lot of money to education. And Eisenhower was incredibly critical of book bans because, there were book bans taking place, and he just adamantly opposed them because he understood the importance of education. And because of these measures, the United States, in 10 years, about 10 years from when the United States decided, all right, we're going to get serious about outer space, to landing someone on the moon. That is absolutely remarkable. The speed with which that happened is incredible. I know I've said this before, but Thomas Jefferson did not experience any mode of transportation faster than Jesus of Nazareth. So we're talking about thousands of years where the horse-drawn carriage is the fastest mode of transportation, and then after that it's the railroad, and then everything just explodes. But to be able to land a man on the moon in 10 years, a little over 10 years, is a remarkable feat that only a country as rich as the United States and with such a good education system could get accomplished. So that was started during Eisenhower's administration. And obviously, the Apollo program and landing on the moon happens a decade later, but he definitely deserves credit for that accomplishment. One final thing that happens during Eisenhower's administration is Cuba. During, if you remember, the United States had liberated Cuba from the Spanish, and Cuba had come under the control of a dictator. That dictator, like most dictators, were doing a terrible job about looking out for the majority of the population. So, a revolution will rise in Cuba, led by a guy named Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro was wildly popular in the United States. He was, Time magazine ran him on the front cover, and he was considered a hero. There were comparisons to George Washington, a revolution to overthrow a tyrannical dictator. And he was very popular at first until he got into power. And then once he got into power, Cuba was an insanely poor country. One of its biggest resources was sugar. The sugar plantations were owned by mostly foreign businesses, a lot of American businesses. So in order to bolster up the Cuban economy, because Cuba was a veritable third world country, Fidel Castro nationalized the sugar industry. And when I say nationalized, I mean he took over the sugar industry for the government of Cuba. Now, in fairness to Fidel Castro and the people of Cuba, they were in poverty and they needed to have some way of building up their economy, and sugar was one of their most important natural resources. America, though, did not take it well. When this happened, Americans just immediately freaked out. And as mentioned before, it's generally agreed upon the Soviet Union started the Cold War, but the United States will do things to exacerbate it. And this is one of those situations. The United States immediately froze all Cuban assets in the United States. That is the strongest form of economic action that can be taken against an enemy. Freeze all their assets in your country. So, from the Cubans' perspective, obviously, they are just a third world country that is trying to build up their economy. The United States, though, treated him like he was like an enemy and as dangerous. And so the U.S. will turn on him very, very quickly. And by 1960, by the time Eisenhower left office, the CIA had plans to overthrow him and assassinate him. So the United States will very quickly work on plans to overthrow and assassinate him. And this happens over and over again, where the U.S. government will every country is seen in bipolar terms. You're either communist and for the Soviet Union, or you're capitalist and for America. And they don't take into consideration the unique circumstances of the country itself. So from this point on, Cuba will be considered an enemy of the United States, which is why you can't get Cuban cigars. The plans will be set in place during Eisenhower's administration, but they don't actually go into effect till later. On his way out, Eisenhower will do one last thing that there are some people that very much dislike him, but he was a man of character. There are things to criticize, but he will criticize what he called the military-industrial complex, and that is the mass production of weapons in order for politicians and the military to just keep producing weapons. It is one of the hallmarks of the United States from 1945 or from 1947 to the present, is the constant building of more and more weapons, even when they're not needed, because the military, corporations like Lockheed Martin and politicians are all working together, and they will produce a lot of unnecessary weapons, and it will gain a lot of power. So that is what bravery looks like. It is criticizing your tribe. Eisenhower was a all-out military man, but he will criticize the military-industrial complex because it has a lot of negative outcomes economically long-term. So it's one of the most popular farewell addresses, and he deserves the credit for calling out the problem.